We bought 5 of the most popular power supplies on Amazon and Newegg to review, and today is going to be really fun because we have our first set for us of comparative benchmarks for power supplies where we can show you the numbers of all the power supplies on the same charts, just like we do for GPUs and CPUs, to help people decide what's best for them. The power supplies we chose this time are all in the $60 to $80-ish range, so that puts them in sort of the budget to mid-range PC build category. Previously, we've used our power supply test equipment to do stuff like this. Oh, fuck. And this. And we've even reviewed high-end non-exploding power supplies, like the Asus Gundam PSU. And recently we used it to troubleshoot transient issues with the NZXT H1 V2 power supply with high-end GPUs. So this is our first time looking at just a straight-up shootout of power supplies for budget or mid-range builds. So this is what you'll want to check out if you're building a new PC. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by Lian Li's O11D Evo case. The O11D Evo is a mid-tower that tested well previously with us and is most interesting for attention to fine details and its unique features. One of those is the easy-to-use invertible layout. The O11D Evo inversion process is the easiest we've ever worked with on a case, allowing it to flip entirely for a unique upside-down build or work as a standard layout. The O11D Evo has 2 chambers for the system and the power supply, support for up to 9 storage drives, and edge-to-edge glass for a showcase, while still offering excellent airflow through side and bottom intakes. Learn more at the link in the description below. So the power supplies you see on the table here are what we chose. I worked with Patrick Stone on our team, who did the power supply testing to figure out our part selection, and ultimately our criteria is pretty simple for this. When we bought these back in December, we were buying in the $60 to $80 price range, and our next really primary point for selection was just has to be voted pretty high up, either by user reviews or by whatever most popular ranking the retail website has. And we'll put a table on the screen with the power supplies we chose. This includes things like the warranty period and some other basics like modularity, but overall we need to look at the benchmarks to see how they are for efficiency, for voltage ripple, for the protections mechanisms working. And remember that there are thousands of actively sold power supplies, and we're still just getting started with building out our power supply review data sets. So it'll take us a while to go through them and really build up the charts. If you have a power supply you really want us to look at, especially in this price range, please leave us a comment in the comments below. We're going to be reading them and trying to figure out what to buy next to add to this data set. Now that we have a baseline of 5, we can grow it from there. And make sure you upvote each other if you agree with someone else's suggestion as well. All right, so all of that stated, this is obviously not a best power supplies under $80 or anything like that. It's really just looking at these 5, and we need to start somewhere. So you don't just start with a big table of data like we have in our CPU reviews or GPU reviews and our cooler reviews. We do have to start somewhere, and this is going to be it. As a primer, you've seen our CPU and GPU benchmarks before. They look something like this normally for average FPS. We also show 1%, 0.1%, and we occasionally introduce charts plotted over time for things like frequency or frame time consistency. So we wanted to define our goal for power supply reviews very clearly here, and the goal is to produce similar comparative charts to make it easier to tell at a glance which power supply performs the best versus its peers, and also how the value is. Our channel has always been focused on things like the value proposition, consumer advocacy, of course, being a large part of that, and getting the most use out of something that you're buying for your computer. And so for that, we need those comparative charts. Power supplies are incredibly complex, and this is why in the past with our power supply reviews, you've seen charts that basically just look at that one power supply against itself. We don't really show much else on it because there's already enough to look at. So that's why we're breaking the mold today, how we're trying to change our process to improve it going forward. We still have more types of tests we're adding to power supply reviews. For example, we'll soon add noise testing with our new acoustic chamber, but for now our focus remains on efficiency, protections, regulation, and ripple. The power supplies today range from 550 to about 700 watts, and the age range of them is 2015 to 2021. Power supplies from 2015, they don't really go bad, these designs, so it is a component that can be made for a long time. So that's what we're looking at. Let's get started. We're going to go through the basics of what we chose now. This is where we'll lay out the features of each power supply, including things like the warranty. Of course, if you want to use the timestamps, you can skip ahead just straight to the charts if all you care about is the numbers. So we chose 2 power supplies from Corsair because they appear really similar, but they're actually different internally. The CX650 has an average price of $78, and we bought this one for $55 from Newegg, but it was the before times. It's one of the 3 power supplies in this group with a 5-year warranty, and it's the only one of the 5-year warranty models that uses an LLC topology. We'll talk about that in a different video. The supplier varies, but it seems like the majority of the units come from Great Wall, and the rest are from Channel Well Technology. It's the only non-modular of the 5 power supplies, and it's the only one with fully sleeved cables. In that group of cables, there are 2 dedicated PCIe cables, but unlike the rest of the group, these cables are terminated with only a single 6+ tube connector as opposed to 2 of them. For anyone worrying about that, don't, because if you need so many PCIe headers at the end of the cables, you should probably buy in a higher end or higher capacity power supply anyway. We think this is sufficient. Now, as for the Corsair power supply labeled CX650M with the M at the end, that is available for about $60 on Amazon and Newegg at the time of writing. Externally, the case, the labels, and the semi-modular cable bundle look very similar to the CX650 non-M. It even has exactly the same output current on each rail. Seeing the same 5-year warranty stamp on both the CX650 and the CX650M boxes would probably seal the deal for most budget builders that these 2 power supplies are the same, with the only major difference being the modular cables. But that's not actually true. There's more to it. The main difference is, in fact, the topology. The CX650M is double forward, rather than the LLC topology used on the CX650. Double forward is usually reserved for middle-tier power supplies because it's not as efficient as LLC and has a hard switching characteristic which can cause coil whine at high loads. We didn't experience any whine during our testing, but one sample hardly rules it out. The CX650M is supplied by Channel Well Technology. About the only encouraging thing we can say about it from a glance is that it has the best PFC of the bunch, which we'll look at later. Otherwise, it's not particularly exceptional in any way, good or bad. It's sort of in the middle. The EVGA 700BQ is $50 on Amazon and Newegg right now. It's the last of our 5-year warranty models in this roundup, and it's also a double forward design, at least on the primary side. And while we're on the topic, it's worth noting that double forward topology power supplies at least have DC to DC regulation on the secondary side, which is better than group regulation, for example. The EVGA unit is supplied by Anderson, aka EVGA, and it's the lowest cost unit in the roundup and provides the highest output capacity at 700 watts. Up next is Fractal for its Ion Gold. This is a 550 watt power supply. It's currently $80 on Newegg, but when we bought ours it was $60. It seems to fluctuate a bit depending on the season. It's the first of 2 units that come with a 7-year warranty, and it's supplied by High Power. It's the only fully modular power supply in this roundup. The ATX cable is 1 to 3 inches shorter than the others in this roundup, depending on which one you look at, but otherwise that's the only major difference on the PC side for cabling. On the wall side though, despite being the lowest rated output of our roundup at 550 watts, it's the only power supply that comes with a 16 gauge AC power cable. All the others came with 18 gauge, so it's a nice touch, but of course keep in mind that this doesn't actually matter for any of these power supplies. This power supply doesn't even come close to the limitations of 18 gauge, much less 16 gauge. It is a higher rated cable though, so that's nice to have around, and you can maybe swap it out for an 18 gauge or something if you wanted to use it for something higher power in your house. Another unique feature on this unit is the fan size. It's the only 140mm fan of those power supplies in this roundup. The others are all using 120, and generally, very broadly speaking, this allows for lower speeds to achieve the same cooling, which can help with noise, but obviously depends on the profile and also the cooling solution internally. The last note on this power supply is that it only has one PCIe cable with a set of 2 8-pin connectors at the end. All the others have 2 dedicated PCIe cables. The last entry is the Seasonic Focus GM650, aka the SSR 650FM. The average price on this unit is $83 historically, and when we bought it, it was $64 on Newegg. It's the other 7-year warranty model in this roundup, and it's supplied by Seasonic. It's not much to look at, but it has good hardware overall under the hood, and we'll show you how it performs in the charts. Time to get into objective testing for the power supplies. For this, we're using our specialized power supply load testing equipment to analyze the quality of the power supplies and the functionality of their protections and safety features. We'll be presenting the power supply efficiency at different loads, so that'd be the efficiency of converting AC wall power to DC system power, and we'll also be looking at voltage ripple, stability of the voltage supply, power factor, and hold-up time. Additionally, we'll be testing the safety protection features like overcurrent protection, overpower protection, and short circuit protection. Up first is efficiency. We measure efficiency at 11 loads. For this roundup, we only charted 3 of the load levels for comparison. 2% loads have become more important since the new power supply design guides instituted a 2% load guideline in July of 2020, and that guideline asks for 70% efficiency. Power supplies designed before 2020 almost never meet that standard because it's relatively new. At the lowest load, the non-modular Corsair unit did the best, achieving 63.7% efficiency. The Fractal power supply came in last at 54.3%. None of them met the 70% target, but 63.7 isn't too bad for a 2% load on a relatively cheap power supply. The 40% load was selected because it's where all these power supplies conveniently peaked. At their peak efficiency, or their best overall positioning, the power supplies were clustered together. The most efficient supply, the Ion Gold 550 watt, was 3.3% more efficient, or if you prefer, 2.9 percentage points better than the least efficient 700 watt EVGA unit. 3 of the 5 competitors actually eclipsed the respectable 90% efficiency mark. That's a great spot to be for cheaper power supplies. As for 100% load, this one we like to show because it shows the extreme end of the data. At 100%, efficiency drops from its peak, as is expected in a normal power supply efficiency curve, because it is under complete strain. All 5 power supplies remained in the same ranked positions between the 40 and 100% loads. The Fractal design unit held the top spot, and the EVGA unit brought up the rear. They achieved 88.1% and 83.6% respectively, and that's actually a pretty wide gap despite the fact that they're both in the 80s. When you're talking power supplies, every single digit percentage change starts to really add up fast because they all come so close to each other. Also, when you're talking single digit percentages, or in this case 5 percentage points between them at hundreds of watts, that adds up very fast too. This positions Fractal's Ion in a significant lead over EVGA's for efficiency, with the Seasonic Gold relatively close to Fractal's Ion. An efficient power supply can do the same work that an inefficient power supply can do while using less AC power. That means that an inefficient power supply is just obviously wasting power. In areas with high power costs or surge costs, that becomes especially relevant. Whereas for those of you with really cheap power costs, if you don't have some other reason to care, then, well, it's not as much of a factor in your purchasing decision. Our first comparison is for 12 volt regulation. The chart shows variation across 11 loads from 2% to 100%. We use 10 unit increments from 10 to 100, and we take regulation measurements on each of the 4 rails. So that's 3.3 volts, 5 volts, 5 volts standby, and 12 volts. Today we're focusing on the 12 volt rail since that's the most used. We do have data for the other ones, but in this roundup, it's just not that important for helping the type of buyer looking to pick between these units. All the units in this roundup exceeded our standard for 12 volt variation. More specifically, only the CX650M was over 1%, coming in with a variance of 1.3% total. The Seasonic GM650 was the most stable at 0.2%, which is a pretty great score. Consistent power is good for your devices and helps with stability. So DC power that's output by power supplies as the product of current and voltage is obviously required to power things like CPUs, GPUs, and everything else in the system. If that voltage is constant or relatively constant, then doing things like overclocking or extreme overclocking, if you're really at a higher end than we're looking at today, will be made easier by minimally eliminating the power supply from your list of many concerns for stabilizing the clocks. If power demand from the load or the CPU and the GPU is constant and the voltage drops, then the power supply will increase the current to meet the demand. Increased current means more wear on the power supply's internal components, so the better the power supply can regulate the voltage, the better off your power supply is from a health perspective. Ripple is checked at each of the same 11 loads as regulation. It's 2% to 100%. We perform the measurement using manual cursors on an oscilloscope. A high-quality power supply can keep its peak-to-peak ripple measurement below 30 millivolts, which is our internal standard. But this is a tough request for a low-cost power supply because ripple reduction often comes down to the quality and the tolerances of the components, which is directly related to the cost. For the chart, we'll look at 2 different loads. 100%, because that's where ripple is usually at its worst, so we don't need to see any worse than that. And 60%, because that's around the range where most gaming loads are likely to occur in an optimal setup. At 100% load, the Fractal Ion Gold 550 watt is our top performer. It moves up only slightly from its 60% load number with an increase to 29.4 millivolts peak to peak. This makes it the only unit that gets a passing mark on the ripple test. The others all finished with a ripple measurement around 50 millivolts peak to peak, with the Seasonic power supply coming in at a distant second at 46.3 millivolts peak to peak. At 60%, the low-cost EVGA unit leads the way with the 19.2 millivolts peak to peak ripple, and the 550 watt Fractal design unit comes in second at 25.8, and the rest of the pack falls in around 34. So of these, EVGA and Fractal are the two most interesting ones to look at, the two that did the best depending on the load. Power factor is up now, measured from 0 to 1. Anything less than unity, or a factor of 1.0, means that extra power is required in order to achieve the actual task at hand. In this situation, that would be powering our computer. Some of the power is out of phase and therefore unusable. Less current is drawn from the grid when active and apparent power are unified, which results in lower electricity costs, less heat, and greater longevity for components. We're looking at the 2% 100% data here as a contrast. Once again, power factor unity is the most difficult to achieve at low loads, and because of that, we see the widest variation in power factor at the 2% load. Our worst performer was the Fractal 550 watt unit with a power factor of 0.769, and our best unit was the inexpensive EVGA 700BQ at 0.93. By the time the power supplies are tested at 100% load, they've all nearly achieved unity between the voltage and the current. Every power supply produced a power factor of greater than 0.99 here. The Fractal power supply redeemed itself from its last place finish in 2% by tying for first place with a power factor of 0.997 at 100%. Now, as for which of these is more important, you could argue either. 100%, obviously there's a lot more power being drawn and the efficiency becomes more critical just because at this higher scale of utilization, it starts to cost more in terms of watts or waste, whatever that unit may be, depending on what you're measuring. At 2%, it's a lot less impactful. It's a lot less likely that you're going to run into some kind of stability issue, but at the same time, it's more likely that the computer will be at 2% for more of its life, depending on the use of the computer. Our last set of important data is for protection features. We tested short circuit protection, overcurrent protection, and overpower protection. Everything except for the Fractal Ion Gold 550 watt demonstrated proper protection triggering in all of our tests. The Fractal unit mostly did, but it was able to supply 5 volts standby at up to 8.19 amps, which is actually the limit of our test equipment, not till the point at which it triggers. This means that it's possible that the Ion Gold 550 has OCP on the 5 volt standby rail, but we're not able to see it because it would be in excess of 273% of the rated current of 3 amps, and we're not equipped to test that high because it's not really an expected scenario. Testing is carried out by our SM8800 ATE. For short circuit protection, the 8800 shorts each load to ground. For overcurrent and overpower testing, we have start and end currents that we've set, and we adjust based on the output of the power supply, while the current stepping amount and timing intervals are kept consistent. For overpower protection, or OPP testing, we expect triggers at or below 140% of the maximum rated output of a power supply. The reason you don't really want it to be higher than that is because you're trying to avoid certain scenarios like thermal runaway, for example with MOSFETs, or just unsafe explosions where it gets to be a little too exaggerated. So these values, like the 140% maximum output current for the specified rail, brings the power supply close to but not past the point where the internal components begin that thermal runaway danger. Our test results met these expectations for the most part, but as we've continued to test power supplies, we've found that the 5VSB rail often hits trigger points of 180% and greater on this minor rail. So this is an area where we just need to learn a little bit more about 5VSB and what the manufacturers are trying to achieve. We'll continue to watch the 5VSB OCP numbers as we test more and more power supplies and formulate a position as to whether or not these values are problematically high when we have enough data. 12 volts and total power though, we're good on those numbers. For the Roundup, 12 volts, 5 volts, 3.3 volt OCP tests and OPP tests were all in line with our standards and tripped around 140% or less for every power supply. The 5VSB OCP test showed that every PSU, except the Corsair CX650, tripped at values over 200% of their maximum rated current. Up next is crossload testing. This refers to the heavy loading of one output set to see if it skews the output voltage of another one. In our testing, we apply a heavy load to 3.3 and 5 volts, and we observe the effect it has on the 12-volt rail. Some examples of this would include if you were to load up the 3.3 and 5-volt rails with things like a lot of SSDs or RGB LEDs, some fans, stuff like that, and then see how that affects the regulation on your power provided to the GPU or the CPU on 12 volts. So we also apply a load to the 12 volt and watch what happens to the 3.3 volt and 5 volt minor rails. Ideally, we'd like to see less than 5% variation from the specified voltage. So for instance, when applying a heavy load to the 3.3 and 5 volt rails, we'd like the power supply output on the 12 volt rail to be as close to actually 12 volts as possible. And it's considered a success if the percentage of variance from that 12 volt value is less than 5%. We have two graphs for this. They demonstrate that the power supplies in this roundup have good regulation of their voltages when crossloads are applied, as none of the values exceed 1%. When a heavy load was applied to the minor rails, the Corsair CX650 did the best job of maintaining its 12 volt output with a value of 12.03 volts. That resulted in only a 0.4% variation. When the heavy load was applied on the 12 volt output, the CX650 did well once again. But the Fractal design power supply pulled ahead due to a steady 5 volt output. The Ion Gold 550 produced 5 volts, and that's 5.00 dead, so great result there, and 3.31 on its respective outputs, resulting in a 0% and 0.3% variation shown in the graph. So some sort of rapid fire conclusions then, just to recap the pros or cons of each power supply of the 5 we looked at. For Fractal, let's start with them. The Fractal Ion we looked at, the 550 watt model, if you have a system that can be fully supplied by 550 watts, which will fuel most gaming PCs today, if you're looking at something like a 3080 or higher i7-99, AMD R9 CPUs, might want to consider going up at least 50 watts, but 550 watts is a good starting point for most people. Anyway, if you commonly shut down your PC rather than letting it go into an idle state, the Fractal Ion does well. Where it slipped the most was in its 2% load performance and efficiency. It had the most trouble there. Since it's fine at higher load, this obviously is mostly a concern if you just leave your PC sitting for a long period of time doing nothing in particular. So it's inefficient at low loads. That's the Fractal Ion's biggest weakness for the model we looked at. The Seasonic, this one is the best of the bunch in terms of overall test results. It had no last place finishes in any of our tests, and it stayed near the top in the tests that mattered the most. So those would be tests like voltage regulation and voltage ripple. So Seasonic did pretty well there. It had a couple weaknesses we talked about earlier, but overall it's looking pretty good. The Seasonic unit ballooned well over its average price to $100 plus most recently because it's being scalped or sold mostly by third-party sellers. So we can't recommend it as a budget pick. If it is in that $60 to $80 range, it was in the 70s for a long time, it starts to look actually really good, extremely competitive with these other options, but that's only if you can find it in that price range. So then, without that in a more reasonable price range, we would turn to the enduring 2017 design of the Corsair CX650 Non-M. It ties as the least expensive LLC topology power supply at $80, and we've often seen it sell for less than that. It beats the other $80 LLC design, which is the Fractal Ion, due to the fact that it can output 100 more watts at 650 watts. It also had better than advertised efficiency, as the unit we tested actually qualified as 80 plus silver, even though it's technically listed as bronze, although there's some test equipment variation there as well. The voltage regulation on all 4 rails is nearly on par with the top performer, and that's the Seasonic one. It's only outclassed by the Seasonic option on the 12 volt rail, and that's only by 0.2 percentage points. So that's our middle of the road suggestion, but the CX650M gets more of the you want a budget power supply, but you still need some modularity angle. And then finally for EVGA, it's the highest wattage out of the ones we looked at today. It's at 700 watts, so it's relatively affordable for the wattage. If you need more capacity, that's something worth considering. Additionally, it had pretty strong voltage regulation and voltage ripple at the most commonly used loads we think it would endure as a 700 watt power supply. So that makes the EVGA one tough to beat for the price. There are a ton of other power supplies, including much newer ones as well. So we need to start looking at those. That's our goal next, and that's why we want you to leave comments. Genuinely, we are going to be reading a lot of them to try and figure out what we want to work on next. You know, when you sort by most popular, most reviews, most purchased or whatever on a retailer, you're typically going to get stock that has been around for a long time because it's existed long enough to accumulate all those reviews. So that is both a benefit and a negative to buying your products that way, but it is a way that people frequently buy products, especially those that they don't particularly have much affinity for, like power supplies often land in that space. So that's how we did this roundup, but we've got a lot more we want to do, and we look forward to coming back with even more comparative charts. We're adding to it. As stated, we've got noise we're adding to it. We know how to do noise and thermal testing. We do it on other parts. It's just a matter of adding the processes to the power supplies and building it up even further to hopefully help you all with your selections. This was really fun, very educational for me to work on personally. Patrick Stone has been spending a lot of time learning about power supplies, and it's been a great opportunity for him to learn, and he's taught me as we've worked on this content. So we're really excited to do more of it. Obviously, as always, there are many things we can improve in our testing, in our presentation, in the data and charting that we're doing for new component reviews, but stick with us. Let us know if you think there's something specifically you want to see, and we'll definitely be open ears for all that as we work on even more of these. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.